The world is shocked by this amazing news. Regional rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to resume diplomatic relations after 7 years of open conflicts and hostilities. And this was mediated by China. The three countries hosted rounds of talks from March the 6th to 10th in Beijing. The three countries released a trilateral joint statement. In the statement, Saudi Arabia and Iran promised to restore ties and reopen embassies within no more than 2 months. They also promised to respect each other's sovereignty and will not interfere in each other's internal affairs. This is truly a historical moment. And this also happened during China's annual most important political meeting, the Two Sessions. And I am covering this event these days as a reporter. So to understand the importance and impact of this historical moment, in this episode, I invited two guests from two different continents to join me in the discussion and share their perspectives. My first guest today is from West Asia, research into West Asia. He is of Iraqi descent. He is the West Asia coordinator for the Schiller Institute in Sweden. Hussein Askary. Tell us, as someone from West Asia, as someone who research into West Asia and also the global development, how big, how important is this?
Well, this is the biggest positive development in the history of this region, at least since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, because what this region has experienced has been disasters all along. And if you want to talk about a game changer in world politics, this is it. And also, this is an embodiment of what President Xi Jinping launched as the Global Security Initiative. And also, as attached to that is also the combination of the Global Security Initiative and the Belt and Road Initiative. All are combined now. And this gives hope for solving problems all over the world. First of all, this is to see how important the Global Security Initiative is in this Saudi-Iran agreement. The agreement itself, the first points, are tangent with the Chinese Global Security Initiative. Number one, the respect of the sovereignty of each party. Number two, non-interference in the internal affairs of these countries. Number three, diplomacy is the only way to solve problems. And number four, which is very important, that economic development and trade is the key to establishing and making this whole security arrangement concrete. So there is no security without economic development, and there is no development without economic security. And this is the Chinese philosophy behind the Global Security Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Global Development Initiative. Now, this agreement will have ramifications in a positive sense for the region and for the global security and development process. It will have, this is a rehearsal, I can say, of, I will come back to this region, but the State Councilor Wang Yi said two important things about this agreement yesterday. He said that what this agreement does is it sends a message to every nation in the world that, number one, that whatever the differences you have, how high level the conflict is, you should sit down and talk. If you don't sit down and talk, you will never reach an agreement. It doesn't matter what the differences are. Sit down and talk. And this applies to the Ukrainian situation today, which is very, very dangerous. The other thing he said is that this sends a message that the Middle East nations, the Middle East is for the Middle East nations. It's not owned or controlled or should not be controlled by any global power. The people of this region decide their own economic and political fate. Nobody else. This is very, very important. And I can tell you from my own experience that I'm an Iraqi. Soon, next week, we will see there will be the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, the illegal invasion of Iraq by the United States and Britain. During the preparations for that invasion, I was involved personally through the Schiller Institute as the West Asia coordinator with American economist Lyndon LaRouche and the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute in an initiative in the Gulf involving this whole discussion in 2002. In May 2002, we organized a conference in Abu Dhabi with the Zayed Center for Coordination. And it hosted Mr. Lyndon LaRouche and Mrs. Helga Tsepp-LaRouche, and there were ministers from all the Gulf countries. And the idea was presented there that you should have, exactly as the Chinese idea, that you cannot have security in the region without an economic development idea, a vision. And this was a bit before the Belt and Road Initiative. And I want to share with you the concept which was presented there. This is the combination of the Schiller Institute's vision for integration of Eurasia and Africa, and combined with it is the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you look at the region where Iran and Saudi Arabia are, this is the concept which we presented then, is that if you have a circle around this region, which includes even Egypt, which is very, very important, these nations, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, the Gulf countries, Iraq, and all these nations together there. This is what Mr. LaRouche called the crossroads of the continents. And he said that what is necessary now to establish peace is to have a unified economic policy for massive infrastructure development of, for example, using the natural resources and the human resources of this region, like oil and gas, in not as raw materials, but to build industries. But if you look at this region, and this region not only geographically is between all the continents, but also with the Belt and Road Initiative, both the land-based economic belt of the Silk Road, which is on the land, and the maritime Silk Road converge in this region. Also, in this region, you have 2/3 of the world's oil reserves. You have financially, I mean, you have, in terms of population, there's 500 million, mostly young people inhabiting this region, and the population is growing. This is an enormous resource and also a market, but also a hub. You have, in the sovereign wealth funds of these nations, you have more than $3 trillion in these funds, which are not really utilized in a very good way. And China actually presented an idea, President Xi Jinping in December, in his summit with the Gulf countries, he presented a number of ideas, relevant here. One of them was to utilize the financial resources of these countries. And I advise that the financial resources of these countries be used as credit for Belt and Road infrastructure projects all over the world, not only in this region too. So you have now, in this potential region, convergence of a very important security arrangement, which will stabilize the region, also a massive economic development process. So this is a really dramatic shift in the world situation. This region has been what is called the cockpit of international geopolitics. This is where all the big powers used to fight in this region. Now suddenly we have this region, you might have the big powers cooperating in this region, and hopefully the West will react positively to this development and end these geopolitical manipulations. In terms of what is important for this region, that the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia will have importance for stabilizing the situation in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen. And to my knowledge, China and Russia are involved in a peace process in Yemen itself to end that horrible conflict which Saudi Arabia is involved in. And some people say Iran is involved as a proxy war. Now, all these countries I mentioned have been devastated by a semi-civil war situation. We have the Shia-Sunni divide, which Iran and Saudi Arabia can bridge. If you involve Egypt in that, which I hope will happen, normalization of relations between Egypt and Iran is very important, as President Xi Jinping made that point in 2016. So we will have the possibility of all these conflicts now resolved. But within that context, we will have the opportunity now, by stabilizing the security situation, that economic development through the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives will become concrete. And one of the important Belt and Road, one of the 6 major corridors of the Belt and Road is the China, Central Asia, West Asia corridor, which extends through Iran. That's where West Asia starts, to Iraq, Syria, and the Mediterranean, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Yemen. So you can unify the resources and the geographical potential of these nations to launch a massive economic development program, which is, in my view, is very easy to implement.
And I remember just a few days ago during the Chinese foreign minister's press conference during the 2 sessions, which is China's annual most important political meeting, and I'm covering it these days. And so during the press conference, Mr. Qin Gang addressed China's relation with Middle East countries. And he said China supports the strategic autonomy of Middle East countries, and also China supports Middle East countries as the masters of their own internal affairs. And once again, he stated that China has no interests in filling the vacuum, the term that some Western watchers accused of actually. So I'm wondering, how do you see these comments? Do you think Chinese opinion are sincere? And do you think China's role in this region will be truly different from the Western alliance?
Well, definitely. I mean, I have been following Chinese foreign policy for many, many years. And all these ups and downs in the world, all the tragedies in the world. I mean, if one has heeded the Chinese way of doing diplomacy, we wouldn't have all these problems. And I think China realizes today, especially, that with all the crises, the very dangerous situation we have in the world, that somebody should intervene with a different outlook on relations between nations, on global governance, and how to achieve peace. Now, the Global Security Initiative, I mean, the foreign minister emphasized also, and the Belt and Road Initiative, that we have to redefine the global relations. It's not like reinventing the global relations, but taking the best principles which are part of the United Nations Charter, which as described by the foreign minister and also in the Chinese Global Security Initiative. As I said, this respect for the sovereignty of nations, that nations are sovereign. Only they and their people have the right to decide their economic, foreign policy, security policy, and so on and so forth, and also their political system. And also that there should not be interference into the internal affairs of nations. This has been one of the biggest problems since 1991, actually, if we don't want to go further back there, because through the intervention mostly by Western powers to democratize other countries and introduce a political system which is completely alien to the social and cultural structures of the nations, created chaos. In my country, Iraq, for example. So the Chinese way of doing things completely shifts the focus away from the disasters we have lived through the so-called rules-based order to the law-based order, international law. Because remember, the United Nations Charter came after enormous suffering. After World War II, we had 2 world wars. And the United Nations Charter was established in that way to prevent these kinds of conflicts from happening again. Now, it was not completely successful, but it set the rules for what international law implies. And adherence to international law is now the importance. But what is fascinating by the Chinese idea of, security, as we in the Schiller Institute also have been pushing for many, many years, that you cannot have security without economic development. And this idea of economic development, I think the Global Development Initiative launched by President Xi Jinping redefines the idea of development in a different way than we have witnessed in the West. In the West, they say, you have to liberalize. First of all, they say if you change the political system, everything will change, which is not true. That the economy will improve if you have so-called democracy and liberties and so on. Then that the market should decide everything. And that if you cannot afford, as now being pushed internationally by the IMF and the World Bank and the EU, if you don't afford to build infrastructure, you should not build infrastructure because you'll end up in a debt trap, which is not true. So China is redefining the concept of development, redefining the concept of security and global governance. And I think this is from this Iran-Saudi agreement, we will see this model more and more concrete. But my hope is that China's initiative for peace in Ukraine will raise the bar and raise the whole thing to a completely different situation. And everybody in the world, especially in Ukraine, in Europe, people need the intervention by a third force, a third party, which will make people sit down, as Wang Yi said, sit down and talk. I mean, the Pope issued such an initiative, the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. We in the Schiller Institute have an international appeal we are lobbying for from Mrs. Helga Tsep-Larouche, that also in 10 points, how to resolve these conflicts. But nations should sit down and talk. This is the first thing. And then you resolve these other historical differences. This is what happened with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and China did an excellent job in making that happen.
Before we started this interview, you told me you were very excited. Like, this is the moment that you've been waiting for so long. Tell us more about this.
Well, my hands are shaking. Because, I mean, this is very, very important. I mean, emotionally, it's very important. I mean, next week, we'll have the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And most people in the world know that this was based on lies. It did not improve the life of the people of Iraq, actually destroyed their life even more than before. And Iraq, after 20 years, we don't have real development. So this is an earth-shaking development. And also, it overturns this insane geopolitical philosophy of zero-sum game. I mean, just before President Xi Jinping went to Saudi Arabia last December, and we talked about this in our previous interview, President Biden was also in Saudi Arabia in July of that year. And what did he offer these countries? I mean, he said, we will not leave a vacuum in this region to be filled by China and Russia. What does that mean? Are you going to build these countries? Are you going to help them build infrastructure and industry and green development and so on and so forth? Or are you going to undermine China's and Russia's ability to help those nations develop? So this philosophy, this geopolitical Anglo-American philosophy, might fall on its face right in this same region where geopolitics have been destroying these countries for centuries, not even for decades. And this is very, very important. And that's why I'm so excited. I mean, I'm an optimist in my nature. I mean, as they say, the best way to predict the future is by making it yourself. And I think we have been working in the Schiller Institute, me personally, and many other people, of course, around the world, to concretize these ideas, to reach this goal. And I'm very happy for this news, and I'm very grateful for China's role in making this happen.
Because now everybody is looking at the United States. How are they going to react to this? So, in your opinion, how will the United States or all its Western allies react to this big news? Apparently they won't be happy about it.
Yeah, I'm sure many people in London and in Washington will lose sleep tonight, or already did last night, because this, as I said, overturns their whole imagined system of rules-based order, that the dominance of the West, that this is the end of history, and our system will prevail in the world. It's not going to happen. This is the reactions will be. Remember when President Xi went to Saudi Arabia, the process which President Xi Jinping started in 2016 resulted in the comprehensive strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia and later comprehensive strategic initiative with Iran. Now, before the Iranian thing happened, when President Xi Jinping was in Saudi Arabia and signed the comprehensive strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia, many people in think tanks in Washington and in London said, oh, the Chinese threw the Iranians under the bus because they went with Saudi Arabia and left Iran behind alone. And I told people, look, this is insane. This is your way of looking at the world. This is the zero-sum game. You are either with Saudi Arabia or with Iran. The Chinese don't think like this. And a couple of months later, suddenly, Iran and China, President Raisi goes to China and signs the same strategic comprehensive agreement with China. So this is how those people cannot comprehend. It's like in the Bible, it says, there was light, but darkness could not fathom it. And those people live in the darkness, and they are unable to understand the light, because it's not in their character, it's not in their nature. Now, this is a minority of people. Unfortunately, they are a very powerful minority. They are the military-industrial complex, or what the former CIA analyst Ray McGovern calls it, the Mickey Mac, the military-industrial congressional media academia complex. And these people control the military policy, security policy, economic policy, media, and now even academic circles. And they push this dark ideology all over the world. But now people around the world are realizing this is not working. And this is hurting us. Like in the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, it hit Germany, who's an ally of the United States. So people in Europe, especially in Germany specifically, but also all over Europe, now we have demonstrations, million-man demonstrations. In France, for example, people are waking up to the fact that this system, this rules-based system, this liberal economic policy has destroyed their life and now is threatening to bring them to the brink of World War III.
This is really a good news, and I hope everybody can try to understand what is happening and learn from this as well. So I'm so happy for this multipolar world as well, just like you, Hussein. So thank you once again for joining me today to share your observations. I will see you next time.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you.
And I have another guest that is going to join me in this discussion to share his perspective. He's a geopolitical commentator and independent journalist based in Nicaragua. His name is Benjamin Norton. So Benjamin, welcome back to the show.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let me ask you, because entire world is shocked by this moment, and everybody is having a hard time to believe that regional rebels like Saudi Arabia and Iran could resume ties. So I know you studied very profoundly into West Asia, Latin America, and geopolitics across the world. So tell us your thoughts. What's your take on this?
I think this is hugely significant. It's a watershed moment in history that is going to fundamentally change the next decades of politics and economics. And I think there are three main reasons for that. First of all, West Asia has been rocked by a lot of violence and instability. The U.S. has been waging wars there in the so-called Middle East for decades now. And the U.S. had been pressuring Saudi Arabia to take a very aggressive line against Iran. And this led to proxy conflicts and instability. So now there's going to be peace in this region, which is very significant for the people living there, but also for the rest of the world. The other significant result is that this is going to be a huge shot in the arm to the BRIC system, which is going to help accelerate the move toward a multipolar world. Iran and Saudi Arabia have both expressed interest in joining the BRICS bloc, and Iran has recently joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this is related to the final third point, which is also very significant, which is oil. Saudi Arabia is consistently within the top three largest oil producers in the world, along with Russia and the US. And Iran, along with Brazil, are consistently within the top 10 largest oil producers. And of course, Brazil is a founding member of the BRICS. Iran wants to join the BRICS. Saudi Arabia has expressed interest in joining the BRICS. So what this means is that if Saudi Arabia and Iran can maintain positive relations, I don't expect them to be best friends, but if they can maintain peace and work together, that means that BRICS is going to be basically become the world's leading institution in terms of oil production and also commodities trading. And that means that OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which controls the price of oil in the global market, is going to basically be affiliated with the BRICS, considering Saudi Arabia is the leader of OPEC. Russia is not a member of OPEC, but Russia is part of OPEC Plus. And Russia, along with Saudi Arabia, are two of the three world's largest oil producers. So, I mean, this is a massive, significant development. And finally, in terms of oil, Saudi Arabia and Iran have both expressed interest in selling their oil in other currencies. Iran has already been doing so because of illegal US sanctions, and Saudi Arabia has expressed interest in doing so. And President Xi, when he visited Saudi Arabia at the end of 2022 and signed more historic agreements with the Gulf Cooperation Council, President Xi had said that China's goal is to buy energy from the Persian Gulf in the renminbi, in Chinese yuan. So this is going to be a significant blow to the hegemony of the US dollar and the petrodollar system. And I can talk more about what that is. But again, I just want to stress that this is a massively symbolic and important development. And the last thing I'll say, summarizing here, is that for me, it really reflects the difference between US diplomacy and Chinese diplomacy. When the US talks about diplomacy, they really mean they want to create more war and instability and conflict. And when they want to destabilize countries like Iran, that they consider their enemies or adversaries. When China talks about diplomacy, it's about encouraging win-win cooperation, encouraging this idea that mutually beneficial development can help different countries instead of the US idea of zero-sum competition. And China can bring together countries that have suffered from years of conflict, like Iran and Saudi Arabia, that didn't even have diplomatic relations for 7 years. So for me, it reflects really the difference between unipolarity represented by the US and multipolarity represented by China.
And we know that Saudi Arabia and Iran, they have very different relations with the United States. Saudi Arabia supposedly to be the ally of the United States, and Iran suffered from multiple sanctions from the United States. And now even those two countries have so many differences on so many issues, ideology, religiously, on many things. They have differences. Now even them restore ties and can sit down and work together. I mean, it must be such a nightmare of a world at peace for the warmongers, wherever they are. How will Washington and the other Western countries react to this?
Well, we've already seen just hours after the announcement of the peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia that an Israeli minister said that Prime Minister Netanyahu is guilty of this failure, and now it's going to be a very bad thing for Israel, peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Of course, Israel has been pushing for war on Iran for a long time. So the fact that there are already leaders in countries like Israel, which is basically part of the West, the collective West, they're already criticizing this peace agreement as something bad, which reflects the fact that they don't want peace. They see peace as something negative, not something positive. But the reality is that if you look at the rest of the world and the rest of the region of West Asia, so many people are welcoming this because it has destabilized the region. And we need to understand that the US has pushed Saudi Arabia and encouraged the most extremist religious elements inside Saudi Arabia for many decades. in order to use them as proxies to destabilize Iran and other countries. This goes back to the late 1970s when there was a revolution in Afghanistan and socialists came to power. And then after, the United States, through the CIA, along with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, through Pakistani intelligence ISI, it was a very different time. Pakistan has changed politically. Saudi Arabia has changed politically. But in that time, the US, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia used extremist religious elements in Afghanistan, known as the Mujahideen, to try to destabilize the socialist government in Afghanistan. It led to a Soviet military intervention, which was requested by the Afghan the Afghan socialist government. They requested Soviet intervention. And in response, the CIA helped cultivate these extremists, and they eventually became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And we know that after that, there were other wars across West Asia, the war in Iraq, the war in Yemen, and the war in Syria, the war in Libya. And in all of these conflicts, very extreme Salafi jihadist groups played a key role. And they were ideologically motivated. Many of them were motivated by an ideology similar to Saudi Wahhabism, the state ideology. And the US was always pushing Saudi Arabia to support these groups. Ironically, the United States claimed to be fighting these groups in the so-called war on terror, while actually cultivating and supporting them to try to destabilize Iran and Syria and Iraq and Lebanese Hezbollah and other groups. Now, fast forward, and we now see that Saudi Arabia has recognized that this has been disastrous, not only for itself, but for the entire region. And this is one of the many reasons why Saudi Arabia has been moving toward a more non-aligned policy. Because for decades, Saudi Arabia was very subordinated in its political and economic policy to the United States. But we've seen in the past few years that Saudi Arabia has been pursuing more of an independent foreign policy, not only working more and more closely with China, but also more and more closely with Russia, signing a military agreement with Russia, buying Russian military equipment. And this has led the United States to be very angry and to meddle in Saudi Arabia's internal affairs. And that has only further accelerated Saudi Arabia's move toward a more non-aligned policy. So I don't expect Saudi Arabia to be an adversary of the United States, like the US considers Iran to be an adversary, in scare quotes, with this very aggressive mentality. But I think it reflects, again, this multipolar world and the rebirth of the non-aligned movement, where we have countries that are able to have positive relations with the West and the so-called East. They can have good relations with China and Russia and the US and India and many other countries, and they don't want to pick sides in this block competition like we saw during the first Cold War. And Iran has been at the spearhead of the attempt to build a multipolar world. Iran has been, as I mentioned, integrated into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with China and Russia and India and Pakistan and Central Asian nations. They represent over 40% of the global population and over 1/3 of GDP globally. And Iran is going to join the BRIC system, which is going to expand. So for me, this is yet another sign of the world historic shifts that we're seeing everywhere we look. And Iran has always played a key role in that. But now even Saudi Arabia, a longtime U.S. ally, is joining as well, which reflects longtime U.S. allies like Turkey, Egypt. Even they're going to be joining in this new multipolar world.
This took place in Eurasia, but of course, the impact will be not just on Eurasia. It has huge impact to the whole world. Like you just mentioned, BRICS. You've based in Latin America for a very long time, reporting news from Latin America and analyze the geopolitics across the world. So I'm wondering, how does Latin America see China's role in Latin America and across the world?
Well, across Latin America, China is seen as a very positive force because China is the only country that comes to countries in Latin America and says, how can we help you in a way that's mutually beneficial for both of us? Whereas the US, and before the US, the European colonial powers were only interested in what they could extract from the region, not what they could provide to help the region. So that's why so many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have joined the Belt and Road Initiative, because China is helping them to build infrastructure. The European colonial powers colonized Latin America since the late 1400s. For hundreds of years, And then the US has basically considered Latin America its colonial so-called backyard for 200 years. This year, 2023, is the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, in which the US essentially declares Latin America to be its so-called backyard. And every week, basically, we hear politicians in the United States refer to Latin America as its backyard with this very colonialist ideology. So the point is that after hundreds of years of Western meddling in Latin America, the only country that has finally come to the region and said, we want to help you build infrastructure is China. So it's no surprise why China is so popular in Latin America and in Africa. We hear many African leaders say the same thing. In fact, a Liberian minister recently tweeted, he said, China has built more infrastructure in Africa in a few years than the European colonial powers built in centuries. So again, it's no surprise. Now, furthermore, across Latin America, China has become the largest trading partner of the majority of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what that means is that not only do the leftist leaders in Latin America who are more anti-imperialist and who are critical of U.S. meddling and intervention, not only do they see China as a very positive force, but even many businessmen, even many companies, capitalists in the region who simply want to make money. I mean, they, of course, some of them have very positive relations with the U.S. as well, but they recognize that China is a massive country with 1.4 billion people, a huge market, and many economic opportunities, favorable trade opportunities. So across Latin America, the point I'm saying is not even on the left, but sometimes even on the right, China is seen as a very popular force, a very popular economic and political power. Now, in terms of what this agreement could mean for the region, it's going to be significant largely in terms of oil and in terms of the dollar. Across Latin America, we see an attempt by countries to free themselves from the dependence of the US dollar. That is a quote from Brazilian President Lula da Silva. When he campaigned for president in 2022, he said at a campaign rally that his goal is to create a new pan-Latin American currency for bilateral trade in order to free the region from the dependency on the US dollar. In the Americas as a whole, including North, Central, and South America, according to the US Federal Reserve, 96% of trade, of bilateral trade, international trade in the region is invoiced in US dollars. So that means that the US has significant influence over trade in the region, and it means that the US can impose illegal sanctions. Now, they violate international law, but because there are very few restrictions in terms of taking action against the U.S., which is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, so we can't take the U.S. to the International Criminal Court. The Pentagon just told the U.S. government not to work with the criminal court. I mean, so the point is that the U.S. is this kind of rogue state. So that means that the U.S. can impose sanctions on any country it doesn't like. That's exactly what it did to Venezuela. It's what it's done to Cuba for more than 60 years. It's what it's currently doing to Nicaragua, where I am. It's constantly threatening more countries in the region with sanctions. So that means that countries around the region across the region are looking for new currency opportunities so they can be more independent. They can carry out a policy, and if the U.S. doesn't like it, then the U.S. can't simply sanction them and destroy their economy. And this is especially in the case of places like Brazil, who are part of the BRICS system. Argentina has joined to become part of the BRICS, the extended BRICS Plus bloc. So they're currently working on creating a new currency called the Sur, which means south in Spanish. And what's important about that is that it's not going to be a currency adopted by every country for their national currency. It's a currency for international trade with each other. And we already see similar kind of attempts to get off the US dollar in relations between China and Argentina. The People's Bank of China and the Central Bank of Argentina have already done currency swap lines with each other, which is a way of providing liquidity to Argentina and providing, basically a form of providing loans to Argentina that don't involve US dollars, because Argentina is constantly suffering from economic problems because it's spending so much of its dollars paying off its dollar-denominated debt, which means it can't stabilize its currency. It means it faces a lot of macroeconomic problems. So China has already been working with Argentina using other currencies. And now if countries in the region can buy oil in other currencies, it's going to be a huge benefit because it means they don't need to get as many dollars. And this gets back to the point of the petrodollar. When President Xi announced in late 2022 that China is going to be buying oil and gas from the Persian Gulf in yuan, it was a world historic development because for 50 years, the international oil trade has been dominated by the US dollar, and this is known as the petrodollar system. This goes back to really 1971 when US President Richard Nixon removed the linking between the dollar and gold. Before that, since the Bretton Woods Conference at the end of World War II in 1944, the dollar was made the global reserve currency, and the dollar was linked to gold, which meant that anyone who had dollars all around the world could convert those dollars for gold at a set rate of $35 per troy ounce of gold. But in 1971, so that meant that before 1971, the dollar was as good as gold. It was basically the same as gold. It was paper gold. But in 1971, US President Richard Nixon removed the dollar's link to gold. And then in 1974, the US and Saudi Arabia signed a historic agreement in which Saudi Arabia agreed to sell its oil for dollars. And in return, the US would provide military support and protection for Saudi Arabia. So that means that since the 1970s, the vast majority of oil in the global market has been sold in dollars. That means that any country around the world, like Argentina, that needs to import oil, they have to get dollars. So if they can instead buy oil with yuan or Russian rubles or other currencies, maybe a basket of currencies, that provides them many more economic opportunities. And it means they don't need to get as many dollars, which means they don't need to be as dependent on the United States. And it also means that it could encourage them to increase their bilateral trade with countries like China in order to get more yuan, which means that instead of taking loans from the IMF and the World Bank, which have trapped these countries in unpayable, odious debt and imposed neoliberal structural adjustment policies on them, these countries may instead decide to take loans in currencies, in other currencies like, renminbi, right? And that's actually basically what we already see happening between Argentina and China. So I could talk about this for a long time, but the point is that this is very significant, not only for Latin America, but for any country in the world that relies on importing commodities, and especially importing oil, because for decades, in order to import oil and other commodities, those countries have had to have dollars, which means they have to do trade with the United States. They have to rely on the IMF for balance of payments issues to get those dollars, which means they're stuck with this neoliberal economic model. So now, if China can sell, and other countries, if they can, if the Persian Gulf states and other countries, oil producers can sell their oil in yuan and other currencies, because then that's just going to be a massive boon to countries in the global south and to their economies.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for your analysis. Always a pleasure to have you on my show and share your investigation. I hope to see you in Beijing very soon, or we can meet in Nicaragua.
Yeah, I would love to visit Beijing sometime soon. Thank you so much for having me. I always appreciate your show.